The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello. I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar hosted by Dawn Martin and Brad Story of Irwin Legal Agency in collaboration with Anchor, entitled Past, Present, and Future, a history of sexual abuse and molestation liability and mitigation strategies for the IDD population. My name is Christine Masson, and I'm the Director of the Risk Management Division here at Irwin Legal Agency. The topic of sexual abuse and molestation has been at the forefront of the news lately as we continue to see a collective shift in views and key changes in legislation. To effectively manage risk and prevent abuse, it is important for organizations to understand what exposures they have and how to control them to the best extent possible. This includes the type of insurance coverage the organization has in place, as well as what information should be included within the policies, procedures, and training. During this webinar, we will discuss how abuse and molestation liability coverage has evolved, where the insurance marketplace stands today and what we foresee for the future, core components of practical risk mitigation strategies around incidents of sexual abuse. As we understand that this is a significant topic for providers, we will leave as much time as we can at the end of the presentation for any questions you may have. Dawn and Brad will also be available by email to answer any additional questions. It is now my pleasure to introduce our hosts, Dawn Martin, VP of Underwriting, and Brad Story, VP of Risk Management. Dawn started at Irwin Legal Agency as a policy administrator. Her hard work and commitment excelled her to a supervisory role in the underwriting department in 2006, and her dedication and determination led her to the role of Vice President of Underwriting. Dawn oversees ISA's specialty lines unit, and she continues to be involved in the research of new product lines and the development of new programs by working with carriers to build policy forms with industry-specific coverage enhancements. Dawn also assists in developing underwriters' comprehension and knowledge of policy coverage. Brad established his successful career in human services, most notably within the mental health, veterans wellness, and substance use sector. With a foundation built on quality assurance, he strives to not only bridge the gap between exposure and loss, but proactively recognize and amend it. Brad has traveled nationwide to present his expertise in the field of comprehensive human service risk management. It is with this knowledge that he can broaden the risk management services made available to ISA-insured organizations. Welcome, Dawn and Brad, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you, Christine.
Thank you, Christine, and welcome to everyone who was able to join us today. I would like to start out with giving you a little bit of history on how abuse coverage evolved over the last 4 decades. General liability policies up until the early to mid-1980s were largely silent in regards to abuse molestation coverage, meaning that there were no exclusions in the insurance policy. However, there were also no clear coverage grants either. This all began to change after a dramatic rise in civil and criminal cases against religious and secular organizations over crimes against children. At that point, insurance carriers then began to limit or completely exclude coverage for acts of abuse or molestation. There was never an intent to provide coverage for acts that were either intentional or criminal. These complete exclusions, however, were short-lived, as insurance carriers saw the need to provide the coverage to their insured and the fact that they could get more premium in order to support the losses. Some carriers created endorsements to add to existing general or professional liability policies, while others offered standalone policies. It was under these types of policies or coverage endorsements that organizations were covered for claims of misconduct that included actual or threatened acts of abuse perpetrated by their employees for whom they were legally liable. These forms covered compensatory damages, attorney's fees, and defense costs. Each carrier had a different name for the coverage, whether it was abuse molestation or sexual misconduct. Some forms back then only covered employees abusing individuals that were being served and did not pick up client-to-client allegations or client-to-third party. and that appears to be the same today. It was not until around 2010 and later that carriers started to add some employee defense reimbursement coverage to their policies. This coverage was reimbursement for an agency who provided a defense attorney to their employees if they believed that they were not guilty of the allegations being made against them. General liability policies cover occurrences, which are defined in the insurance world as accidents including continuous or repeated exposure to substantially the same general harmful conditions which result in bodily injury or property damage that are neither expected nor intended from the standpoint of the insured. This definition posed an issue when you were speaking of sexual abuse or molestation incidents, because how could such an act be considered an accident or a foreseeable event? There was obviously intent from the standpoint of the perpetrator, therefore there would not be any coverage or defense for an individual who committed the crime. However, what about their employer? The policyholder generally needed to prove that their claims arose out of an occurrence in order for coverage to exist. Although there would be no coverage for the perpetrator, employers believed that they would be vicariously liable for the actions of their employees and that they should still have the coverage. Claims against the organization were brought based on allegations that the employer was negligent in their supervision, their hiring, or their retention of these employees. However, did the employer have any knowledge about the prior abuse by the employee? If so, one could make a case that the bodily injury sustained by the victim that resulted from the abuse could be considered expected from the standpoint of the employer, and therefore no coverage granted for them either. Due to the number of claims that were occurring back then, and the fact that the claims were being reported for incidents that happened several years prior, insurance carriers began changing their policy forms from occurrence triggers to claims made and reported triggers. This meant that the incident must be reported within the policy term and must have occurred after a retroactive date shown on their policy. So it did not matter that the incident happened in the past. As long as it happened after the retroactive date, there would be coverage on the current policy. This gave carriers a better idea of what their exposure was than going back to the first time they wrote the policy when it was on an occurrence basis. What does coverage look like today? And what should you look for in the abuse coverage for your organization? You need to have a really good understanding of your abuse and molestation coverage because all carriers are different. You need to make sure that your coverage is broad enough that it applies to physical as well as sexual abuse. It should cover client-to-client incidents, staff-to-client, and third-party to client. You should have a good understanding of what limits you have and whether or not you have separate limits, or if your abuse coverage shares the limit with either your general liability or your professional liability coverage. You really want to see that your abuse has its own dedicated limit. When the limits are shared, any general or professional claims during the policy term will erode your aggregate limit, therefore leaving less coverage available should you have an allegation of abuse. Due to all the market disruptions surrounding abuse coverage, you will really need to align your organizations with brokers and carriers with a specialty in the human and social service field. Not all carriers have an issue with offering the coverage and at limits that make sense for your organization. The current market conditions, as I am sure many of you are already aware, have probably experienced shrinking limits or worse, elimination of your coverage in some cases. Today, the market for abuse molestation coverage is much different than it was in the 80s and 90s. You will find that carriers are taking a much more conservative approach when it comes to this type of coverage. We will take a look at why these changes are occurring in a moment, and you will see that in some cases it boils down to a misunderstanding of some changes in legislation. Today's issues. We've all heard about high-profile abuse cases, whether it be in the Catholic Church, the Boy Scouts, the Jerry Sandusky cases at Penn State, or the Larry Nassar case. The most recent issue we're seeing is the legislative changes taking place with the Child Victims Act. There are states that are changing their statute of limitations and opening up revival windows, which gives victims a chance to bring their claims forward when previously the statute of limitations had run out. This is one of the major reasons that carriers are making drastic changes to terms and conditions relating to abuse coverage. Carriers currently are running scared and do not have a good understanding of the legislation. The legislation centers around children, thus the Children's Victim Act. Organizations that serve youth, for example, agencies who provide foster care, are more vulnerable to this legislation and the changes in the statute of limitations. Human service provider organizations that serve mainly an adult population, especially in the IDD arena or in the behavioral health or addiction treatment arena, do not have the same issues, and in fact, depending on the state, have entirely different regulations. Partnering with insurance carriers who understand these key differences and the fact that the Me Too movement has nothing to do with this legislation is key to being able to maintain your abuse molestation coverage and the limits that you need. What we thought the future held for abuse coverage is actually happening now, and we do not see an end in sight for these changes. Late 2019 and first quarter of 2020 found us deep into the COVID pandemic, which threw the world into a tailspin. The revival windows that we just talked about were being extended, which continue to make carriers nervous. The insurance market over the past 10 months has taken a very knee-jerk approach to abuse coverage and has been changing terms, limits, and conditions without taking the time to understand the issue at hand. Carriers, as we predicted, have been cutting abuse limits, and this started with reducing the amount of limit they were offering within their umbrellas, and some carriers began excluding the coverage altogether in their umbrellas or in their underlying, and were leaving, sometimes just the underlying in place. Other carriers began removing coverage completely based on what types of services an organization was offering. For many organizations, especially those who provide services to the youth population, abuse molestation coverage is becoming increasingly difficult to find, and where it can be found, it may be extremely expensive. However, as I mentioned previously, seek carriers who specialize in the human services industry, as you will have an easier time finding the coverage needed to suit your situation and at reasonable prices. Coverage today may look very differently than it did in the past. You may see the lower limits I just talked about, or you may see carriers requiring deductibles or retentions as a condition to providing the coverage. Carriers will be changing to claims-made policies, possibly, and only offering defense inside the limit, where in the past you enjoyed defense outside your limits of liability. We do not foresee the industry going back to the large limits of years past, when you could get $25 million of abuse coverage, or at least not with one carrier. We think that you will see carriers who are experienced and understand the human services field continue to offer reasonable limits, terms, and conditions, and supplement with excess limits through multiple carriers, in some cases most likely in the non-admitted market. The coverage may be a bit more expensive, but should still be available and may be structured a little differently. The best way to make sure that you are still able to obtain your coverage and control the pricing is to control your losses. I would like to turn it over to Brad now, and he will speak about mitigating your exposure.
Excuse me. Thank you very much, Dawn. As Dawn mentioned, obviously the best way to manage your premium is to manage your risk. In order for potential abusers to function within your organization, there are three key things that they're going to need. And I would like everybody to remember these throughout the presentation today, as we will go back and discuss them. Those are access, privacy, and control. Some of the key elements to a good quality abuse mitigation program are as follows here. So company culture is perhaps the most important, really our foundation, which sets the tone for the rest of the organization. Screening and selection, which typically, is thought of as background checks, but is much more than that, which we will discuss later on in the presentation. Policies and procedures is what creates our bandwidth of acceptable behavior and also communicates a zero tolerance policy for abuse. Our training is our opportunity to be proactive, identifying red flags and what types of grooming behavior we're seeing today. Internal feedback allows for the collection, compiling, and analyzation of data for quality improvement activity. Monitoring and supervision, which is one of our best defenses to eliminate peer-to-peer abuse incidents, as well as responding. At this point, the horse is out of the barn, but we can still mitigate situations based on how we respond to them. As you will see, much of what we're going to discuss today really all rolls up into developing your company culture around this issue. When we talk about board involvement, if you haven't had an issue or an abuse incident, ask yourself when the last time that this exposure was discussed at your board meeting, potentially for insurance coverage issues that Dawn was talking about earlier. But by and large, unless there is an incident, this is not a hot topic that we've heard in boardrooms. Executive management views play a significant role in company culture and really set the tone for the body of the organization, setting clear expectations through policies and procedures and regular and ongoing training. Systems of accountability, responding and the investigation process, which we will talk about a little bit later. Centralizing procedures and standardizing operations. Obviously, we want to make sure that our procedures and standardization are developmentally as well as age appropriate. So as we talk about screening and selection, this is the first line of defense against potential offenders. Less than 5% of offenders have criminal records. And really what that means is 95% of your applicants either aren't offenders or just haven't been caught. And this really dispels the concept of, we did a background check. We have to think in much larger terms than that based on this statistic alone. The process presents a zero tolerance policy and identifies high-risk applicants. Ultimately, our goal here is to have candidates with bad intentions or the potential to be abusers to self-select out. And you can do that through a variety of ways, through your application, through your interview process, making sure that any potential applicant understands the seriousness of this exposure and that the organization has a zero tolerance policy and takes this very seriously. During the interview, we want to ask behaviorally based questions. And some examples, I'll give you two here, is really first one, describe the two most frustrating situations you've had to deal with involving whatever the population specific is and how you've handled them. Another example could be, often we're expected to adhere to policies that don't make sense to us. Can you tell me about a time when you had to adhere to a rule that didn't seem reasonable, and how did you handle that situation? We want to stay away from leading questions as well as yes and no answers. We want to understand the intent and thought process behind the individuals. Obviously, that second question is going to allow us to get a little bit of insight into what we call procedural drift or creep, where an individual may not agree with a particular policy, and what is the likelihood that they are going to adhere to the policies irregardless of their agreement or not. The majority of criminal records originate at the county level. This is where they're going to also be the most accurate, and here are some best practices at the bottom of the slide here that kind of go through what you should be looking at. We understand that background checks can vary in expense, and while these background checks may appear to be expensive, I would like everybody to imagine the cost of an abuse claim and the impact on your organization for not running them. Policies and procedures are extremely important as they set the standard. Again, zero tolerance for abuse. The organization must communicate that it takes consumer protection extremely seriously. It also shows an organizational commitment, and again, as I referenced earlier, provides a bandwidth of acceptable behavior. So, as an example to that, what kind of hugs are appropriate within your organization? Side hugs versus full frontal hugs. Also, would you allow your staff to provide massages to the individuals that you serve? There are a lot of physical interactions when you're working, particularly in 24/7 programming, and we want to make sure that the staff that are working within our organization have a clear understanding of what those interactions are, whether they're appropriate or not appropriate based on our risk tolerance and policies and procedures. And then exception monitoring. Here, we want to monitor those exceptions, but ultimately the goal is to have employees kind of self-police each other. And this requires having very clear policies, having staff correct other staff's policy violations. And you can do that without being adversarial, gentle reminders from each of the staff. So really, you're building that ground up swell versus, the top down executive management, do this, don't do that. We want the body of the organization to understand as well as live what our expectations and our policies and procedures are. Policies help to reduce the privacy with potential victims. And again, I would like you to think back to the beginning of the presentation where we talked about access, privacy, and control. Limit the control of a potential offender might seek to have. Social media interactions. That was a fairly growing grooming ground for predators. At this point in time during the pandemic, there's been a significant uptick in social media usage, and this has become a preferred platform for groomers. If you don't currently have, we strongly suggest sound policies around social media interactions. And, after this presentation, Dawn and I will obviously be available to assist in any questions on that and provide some templated policies. Supervision requirements, policy should clearly define boundaries. The recognition of red flags helps people feel more confident about reporting, and also assists in an acceptable range to prevent false allegations. So as an aside here, one of the things that I think goes not unnoticed, but not as robust as we would like to see, is what our protocols are around departmental transfers. So consider the scenario from the perspective of a continuum of behavior over a long period of time. So if we have an employee who starts out in a day hab program where there is a tremendous amount of supervision from multiple sources, and over that period of time, the employee may have gotten into an altercation with a colleague or an altercation with a supervisor. A year and a half later, they transfer to a residential department. Still some fair amount of supervision, but a little less than we would expect in a rehabilitation program. There are, over the course of 18 months, another couple of small incidents. They may have had an altercation with an individual resident or potentially a family member. And then they move from there into an employment support type of role, where they're out in the community one-on-one with an individual, obviously far less supervision, and then we wind up with some level of abuse incident. When you look back over the continuum of a 3 to 4 year time frame, you can see that there were a couple of red flags here, a couple of red flags here, a couple of red flags here. Ultimately, when you look across that continuum, the picture looks far clearer that we had a potential here to intervene, but none of the individual isolated incidents would rise to a level which would require significant intervention, so to speak. So those are some of the things that we want to kind of look at. And when we do have employees transferring, we do recommend transfer conferences with the supervisor who the employee is transferring from to the supervisor in which they are transferring to. So we have those opportunities to engage around what the behavior of this employee has been, have there been any kinds of red flags, which will allow for further supervision and monitoring of that employee if in fact that is necessary. So training is not a one-size-fits-all and should be tailored to the individual's role, whether that be for management or general direct care staff. Training provides the following benefits, and it teaches how to perform their role in abuse risk management. So again, we want to look for those red flags. We want to look for that corrective kind of behavior from policy drift. It also helps to convey the organization's commitment to abuse prevention and safety. And it teaches the foundational knowledge of the following: how offenders operate. So that's where we're going to talk about the grooming behaviors and some of those things. How to recognize high-risk activities and areas. All of us have these high-risk activities and areas, and we should really consider those as an organization when we're building our training as well as our policy. How to recognize the signs of abuse in victims and how to report suspicious activity, and as well, how do we prevent false allegations. So one of the things to consider as well is whether or not you provide training to the individuals that you serve. We strongly recommend that you make this a part of your general sexual education and health program if you have that within your organization. So what is healthy interactions, what are unhealthy interactions, and providing that level of training. And ask yourself, do those that you serve know how to report and what inappropriate interactions are? So as well as making clear expectations for our staff, we should have clear guidance to the individual served, as well as the family or guardians, should they be involved in the individual's life, and where to go with that information. Establish an organizational-wide training delivery system. So many of us at this day and age have a learning management system, which is phenomenal and can measure compliance with what our training requirements are. Our safety and quality improvement committees can aggregate data on incidents and provide insightful feedback to programming. And then staff meetings in which we can reinforce the expectations and provide for ongoing discussion. It's important to require specialized training, as we discussed earlier, based on those different types of positions. For some of us, even our accounting folks, if in fact they are interacting with the individuals they serve, the individuals you serve rather, those are some of the folks who oftentimes we will not provide any training to because their interaction is minimal. Janitorial staff, if we have those. All of these folks are going at some point in time to likely interact and should at least have a baseline knowledge of our abuse mitigation plan. Schedule routine training that is consistent. Ongoing discussion is critical in mitigating what we talked about earlier in that procedural creep. And the concept of creep or drift is something that I am sure we're all accustomed to. And the frequency in which we have these discussions will also help mitigate that procedural drift or creep. Again, consumer participation, educating both the consumers and the parents or the guardians. It's extremely important to work with families around these topics. Obviously, this can be a sensitive subject to navigate, but ultimately including the family can mitigate situations as they arise. Oftentimes, if it's not an egregious kind of incident or an event, a conference with the family and explaining what occurred and what we're doing to correct those situations in the future can obviously mitigate. When we start to clam up and we're hesitant to be open and honest with the family, that's when we give them no real alternatives other than to seek legal counsel, which is really what we're looking to avoid. Education should be provided in age and developmentally appropriate fashion. Again, parents and guardians, as well as consumers, should have the information on the organization's policy around abuse prevention. Satisfaction surveys. These are a great way to solicit information, and I know many organizations do them, and I know there are some that do not. However, it's a great way to really obtain information about programming and other areas of interaction if they are framed properly. So when you really think of your expectations and you frame those questions accordingly, we can really get some insightful feedback from the individuals that we serve. Having a formal system should be in place for parents and guardians and consumers to report concerns. So do you have a hotline for complaints or concerns? Whether that is anonymous, whether that is you have an ombudsperson in which you have the expectation that people will go to, there needs to be some level of objective outlet for people to bring forth their concerns. And then how are those concerns specifically addressed? Proper supervision and monitoring reduces the privacy offenders need. Again, access, privacy, and control. A clear structure of supervision for staff should be in place because there is an equal risk for both staff and consumers. So for those of you who are in management positions who are on this webinar today, I'd like you to think back to your DSP days. And, no different than what Dawn was talking about earlier, we clearly have a societal shift in thought process around these. And would you yourself be concerned about one-on-one interactions in today's environment? Because 15 years ago, the way we interacted at the direct care level and today are two very different things. And this really is a great place to mitigate the potential for false allegations. Obviously we are here in New York. The Justice Center has been, around for several years at this point in time. And there is a level of criminality that is now involved in these types of abuse situations that don't reach a particular level of egregiousness, but nonetheless have criminal implications for the staff. Plans should be in place for monitoring of high-risk activities and areas. And we touched on this a little bit earlier. You can likely think of 3 activities or 3 areas within your organization off the top of your head. Whether that's a program that you operate that allows for a tremendous amount of one-on-one access, or it can be a particular area within your organization, within the facilities in which you operate, that doesn't necessarily lend itself to good line of sight, or where somebody can kind of creep behind a corner, areas that are not very well lit. All of these are potential areas in which you will be exposed to abuse allegations. Know the difference between who is at risk to be abused and who is at risk to sexually act out. And identifying those things allows us to supervise and monitor these individuals in a more laser-focused way rather than just a standard monitoring and supervision plan. So some of those traits for those who are at risk to be abused, they tend to be lonely, emotionally in need, shy, they may have a disability. Those folks who are at risk to sexually act out will have sexualized behaviors that they exhibit. They will utilize sexually explicit language. They will violate others' boundaries. And they tend to dominate other consumers or service recipients within your program. And I'm sure there are several of you who a name of an individual you serve popped into your head because these are not uncommon traits. That does not mean that these people are predators or that they are abusers. It just means that they are at a little higher risk to sexually act out than some of the other folks that you may provide services to. Responding results in immediate response to red flag behavior and suspicions of abuse. Violations are taken seriously and should be in all organizations. And here is where the responding can tie into the hotline concept. It really allows others to be your eyes and ears where you can't have people at all times. Responses should be swift and they should be structured. In the development of your written response procedures, some of the key elements to responding, there are 3 of them. One of them is to be compassionate. The other is to be transparent, as we discussed a little earlier. And the third is to be confident. Not all the time is everything going to go the way that we want it to, but we need to have a level of confidence that that could be corrected, and it can be corrected fairly quickly. Initiating internal and external response communications when necessary. Crisis management and handling the media are critical. When it comes to handling the media, we need to be very thoughtful and more often than not seek counsel. When you say something to the media and they print it, you cannot take it back. And that is out in the ether for eons now that we live in the internet age. So, one of those examples is we oftentimes will look and Google an organization. And from 2014, you can read what a particular individual at an organization said to the media. Those statements really put us at a disadvantage when it comes to claims management and claims handling if those statements are mishandled. So we always recommend before discussing anything with the media, you should really reach out to your counsel. Oftentimes, many insurance policies will have crisis management coverage, which will also then include a crisis manager who can walk you through how to appropriately respond to media inquiries. Take all reports seriously, respond immediately, and appropriately. So now we get into a little bit of the financial impact. Knowledge of the industry and the population that's served by the industry is really critical in properly managed abuse claims. So as you'll see here, obviously circumstances will be dependent upon what that claim is going to look like. So I want to give that as a caveat. But for the abuse of a vulnerable adult between 2010 and 2015, we averaged out around $205,000. And now as we move into 2016 to current, we see quite a bit of a spike here. One of the things that should be considered in this is social inflation as well. So obviously what a dollar was valued at years ago is a little bit different than it is today. And when you start talking about larger numbers, those things tend to compound themselves. The reputational risk is also, while not financial, has the potential to bleed into a financial impact. So when you lose goodwill of the community in which you're providing services to, that's obviously problematic for all of us. In addition, it can be extremely detrimental when you're in a competitive environment, as many providers are moving into managed care environments in which you're looking to get into a managed care network or things of that nature. These are the types of things that really can set us back a little bit. So in conclusion, overall market conditions are changing, but obviously not all is lost, as Dawn discussed earlier. Risk management and claims expertise are important now more than ever. We're living in a very different world, and making sure that your partners understand all of those attachment points are going to be critical to the success of your mitigation program. And as Dawn referenced earlier, know your insurance partners and what they know about your industry. So before we start taking questions, I did want to share both Dawn and my contact information. We will be getting the presentation out to everybody, so please bear with us. It may take us a little while after this presentation is complete, but you will have it before the weekend. Also, before we start taking questions, I do want to acknowledge the sensitivity of the subject that we're discussing today. So if in fact there is somebody who would like to have a private conversation, Dawn and I will both make ourselves available should anybody want to review specific circumstances that wouldn't necessarily be appropriate for this call today. So with that said, I will turn it back over to Christine, who is managing some of the questions.
That's great. Thank you both, Dawn and Brad. We really appreciate it. We're going to open up the discussion now for some questions we received. The first question we have is, my broker mentioned moving to a claims-made policy. Is this a better choice than occurrence-based coverage?
That's an awesome question. And if I haven't bored you already with all the insurance jargon, I'll give you some more. So having an occurrence policy, if you can still get one, is really, you should take advantage of that. On an occurrence policy, if you have someone that came forward today and claimed that they were abused back in 2014, the policy and the carrier that were in force back in 2014 will respond to that claim. Unlike a claims made and reported policy, which is your current policy would respond to. So if you had, and they have retroactive dates, like I mentioned earlier in the presentation. On a claims made policy, a carrier is going to say, you know, in this policy term, we will cover a claim as long as it happened after your retroactive date. So if the incident happened in 2014 and that's your retroactive date, your current policy would respond to that claim. Claims made policies have certain conditions that have to be met. The retroactive date is one of them. Not being previously aware of the incident is another one. And then changing from a claims made policy, if you have one, and then going back to occurrence can be very expensive. You need to buy what we call a tail policy, which could be up to 300% of the premium. What I would say about either policy, having an occurrence or a claims made, very important that if you're aware of an incident, that you report it to your carrier. You don't want to get into a late reporting situation or on a claims made policy being aware of an incident that wasn't reported and a denial of a claim. So, and especially on claims made policies, you really need to report all your incidents so that you don't get into that situation.
Thank you, Dawn. Next question is for you as well. Is it a better practice to try and detach abuse coverage from other liability lines and seek a separate abuse policy, or is it better to keep them with your other lines?
So I would say, and especially in today's marketplace, if you're going to separate your coverage out and go to a monoline policy, it's going to be extremely expensive. Really, like I talked about earlier, you do want to make sure that your abuse coverage has separate dedicated limits from your general and professional liability limits. But best case scenario is trying to keep it, if you have a full package policy, trying to keep it within your package policy. Monoline coverages are going to be extremely expensive and difficult to find depending on the population you're serving.
In addition to that, Dawn, I think it's important to talk about how claims are brought will also have a slight impact on what coverage lines are going to respond to those. So, you know, the differences between the professional liability, whether that be negligent supervision or the abuse for a true abuse incident, is just another justification to keep everything together under one umbrella.
Great, good point. Thank you both. The next question we have, how often should abuse policies be reviewed and updated?
So there is a short answer and a long answer to this. Typically, we would recommend, along with many other policies, to do a review on an annual basis. However, with that said, you may want to consider doing it more frequently, depending on the circumstances of your organization. So, did you acquire a building in the middle of the year that you're going to be operating programming out of? Does that building have the appropriate line of sight? Are there those kind of high-risk areas within that building? At which point in time we should be doing those evaluations. Did we start a new program in the middle of the year that may have some unique exposures that our organization is not necessarily accustomed to? More one-on-one interactions outside of the purview of the organization. All of these things are things that we want to consider and really review and evaluate. So while we say annually, this really should be a thought process that is ongoing for organizations. Did you bring in a high-risk consumer into one of your residential programs where your previous policies and procedures you're now realizing may have some gaps in them because now we have a different dynamic within that group home or residential environment. It's really, our aim is to get this as part of your culture in an ongoing kind of capacity.
Thank you very much. Next question we have, are defense costs typically covered outside of the limit of liability?
So again, things are changing. I think in years past, you would typically see most carriers provide defense outside the limit, which means really that you have somewhat unlimited defense costs. So if you have $1 million limit, your defense costs are outside of that, which is great because, if there's an award by a jury, then you'd have your $1 million for compensatory damages, and your defense costs will be in addition to that. More often than not, now you may see carriers moving to defense inside the limit, which means that $1 million needs to be available for compensatory damages, your attorney's fees, and all your claims adjusting expenses. So if you're up against a situation where you are now facing defense inside the limit, you may want to ask if you could get your abuse limit increased. This, I think, will give you a little bit more of a buffer and give you, more limit available to cover the defense costs and any jury awards.
Yeah, so if you're inside the limit and you're being offered a $2 million limit, you may want to ask for $3 million, which is what Dawn is saying, so that third $1 million is really going to be able to cover your defense, so to speak, in the event you have that kind of claim.
Thank you. Next question. Any suggestions on mitigating fraudulent molestation claims by family members or guardians?
Yeah, this is fairly interesting and not necessarily uncommon. So we do see this sometimes where the family is not overly involved, and then all of a sudden they get involved and they have a lot of commentary and things without a lot of support for that. I think our best defense against this is really reaching out in an ongoing kind of manner to the family members and keeping that communication solid. And then, no different than anything else, as we constantly talk about in this industry, documenting those interactions. So if the family has concerns, then we want to document those concerns and really put that plan in place as to how we're addressing those. Ultimately, not all of the family members understand the organizations that we often work in and the regulatory environment of them and what we can and cannot do from a licensure perspective and a regulatory perspective. So good family engagement early on is always something that we strongly encourage, and keeping that communication going forward. If there is, based on the person who asked this question, if there are specifics about a situation that you're currently dealing with, I'd be happy to discuss the specifics offline. But as a general rule, those are some of the things that we really look for.
Thank you both very much. That's all the time that we have for questions today. If we were unable to answer your question in the moment, that just means that it requires a little bit of a longer answer, so we will respond via email. And of course, if anyone has any additional questions they think of afterwards or anything they did not want to ask now, Brad and Dawn will be available via email. We will have the recorded presentation up on our website. We will also have a link to the recorded presentation for anyone who's not on our website. And for all future updates on Irwin's Legal Agency, please don't forget to connect with us on all of our social media platforms. Thank you all for attending, and have a wonderful afternoon.